Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of our Lazy series, Lazy Linux. Today, we're going to be learning a little bit about the Linux operating system. We're going to be learning some of the basic commands, and we're going to be learning why you might have an interest in this in the first place. Well, we're also going to be covering a small bit about how to install it. So, with that, let's get into it. If you already have a Mac, then you already have Unix. And Unix, for most of the tutorial that we're going to be dealing with, should be the same. So, in many ways, this is a Unix slash Linux tutorial. But there may be some slight differences and variations, since most of the Unix stack on Apple is based on BSD. And there are some small, subtle, but annoying changes you might run into. The the Mac OS operating the Mac operating system tends to use BSD based utilities, which occasionally means that some of the commands we're going to run are slightly different. But don't worry, you should be able to pick it up fairly quickly and fairly easily. For most of us, we're going to be on Windows. Here in front of me, I have a terminal. It's running inside of Windows Terminal, and it's running WSL. In my particular case, I like Debian. And so we're running a particular version of the Linux operating system, and we're running it with Debian, which means we have apt. But we'll come back to that later. First, let's talk about why you might want to use Linux. It's true that Linux is technically the most popular operating system, but that's just because it's used in Android. And Android itself ends up being the most popular operating system used because Android has the most phones. Linux on desktop takes up a very small amount, at only 1.52%. So you might ask yourself, why would it be worth my time to learn Linux? Well, one thing that these statistics are leaving out is that while Linux does get very little usage on things such as the desktop, it is ubiquitous inside of the server market. And you can see right here that public servers on the internet almost entirely compose something that is Unix or Unix like, which Linux is Unix like. It's probably worth taking a small amount of time to say that Linux was originally derived from Unix, which is an operating system from the 70s. Oftentimes, you'll see Linux running on things that look very similar to this. And because of that, that means that Linux is primarily an operating system that you are going to interface with in what we call the command line or the terminal prompt. This is what I have up above. It's this little symbol. You can configure it to do different things, but by default, most distributions have your username here, the name of your computer, which I've named this computer Moose, and an @ symbol to show you that your user is at this particular computer. You have this prompt symbol after this to simply tell you that everything after this is a command you are running. And then often you will have a blinking cursor like this. I've chosen a line here because I find it to be not particularly annoying or intrusive. If you're coming from Windows, I advise you to install WSL, or Windows Subsystem for Linux. The Windows Subsystem for Linux will make your life much easier when it comes to accessing and testing Linux in Windows. If you don't like this approach, there are other options such as VirtualBox, or you can even use Windows built-in hypervisor, Hyper-V, which will allow you to create virtual machines. But of course, these all require roughly an equivalent amount of setup. I find that WSL is the easiest and most intuitive way for people to get started immediately, though it probably will require that you restart your computer the once during installation. The second thing I would recommend to everybody is to install the Windows Terminal. You may find over the course of your experimentation that you want to play around with different Linuxes, or maybe even compare Linux to PowerShell or other various different virtualizations. You may even want to see if you can try FreeBSD on Windows. If you decide to do any of these various things, it'll help you both in terms of your local systems and remote systems that you want. So without that out of the way, we will look at my particular Windows environment with a WSL session running inside of Windows Terminal. You can see right here I am running Debian. Now that we have a Linux terminal, what are some of the commands that we can run to get around this system? Well, first we can see what operating system we're on. It's true that Linux is the operating system kernel, but different flavors of Linux have different particular attributes to them, such as different package managers. These are all things we'll get into later, but it's important to know that there are several different Linux distributions, as they're called, or distros for short. Some of the most common distributions are Debian, Fedora, SUSE, and Ubuntu. There's also Arch Linux, Manjaro, and even more eclectic ones than that, such as Gentoo, which forces you to build most of your packages. For now, I would say stick with Debian or Ubuntu. These are fairly well understood, they're the most common, and their package manager is easy to explain. In my particular case, I can type uname A, and it will provide me with a kernel. Now, because I'm using WSL, I am actually using the Linux kernel provided by Microsoft. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to know where are we in this file system? Right now, we're seeing a lot of stuff up here we don't understand. This symbol right here is worth explanation, because this is where we currently are. This squiggly line, the tildes, is to denote that we are in something called the home. And home on Linux works much like the users directory in Windows and provides users a place to store their local files away from operating system code or other services that might be running. We can figure this out with a command called pwd, which stands for Print Working Directory. And you'll see here we get home/cosmic. So what does this mean? Well, in much the same way that on Windows you might say C, /Windows, on Linux, you simply type /. This is known as root, and everything in the operating system's file system starts at this /. The second command that I want us to learn is cd, which stands for change directory. And we can actually change directory to that /. Now you'll see our symbol is changed in the prompt to tell us that now we're at /, the very root of the file system. Now, once we're here, we can do ls. Now, to be honest, there is some speculation around where ls actually comes from, but in general, it's short for listing or listing a directory or listing a directory structure. If we type ls, we get this. Now, this doesn't make a lot of sense to you, I'm sure. I would ignore all of these. These WS things, they're specific to WSL, and they never concern us. But if you look at the rest of these are things that come with Linux itself. You have bin, you have boot, you have dev. Each of these has a function that we'll go into in time. And you can see right here is our home directory, just where we left it. We also have a root directory for the root user. We'll get to them later. Now, if you want to get back to your home directory at any time, all you have to do is press CD and simply don't give it any place to go and press enter. You can see now we are back to our home directory. Now we've learned a few commands here. We've learned cd, we've learned pwd, we've learned ls. These are going to be the primary workhorses that you use on the Linux operating system or the Unix operating system. But you might be curious, how did I know how they work? And how do I know what they stand for? Well, each of these commands can be found with another command called man, which stands for manual, M-A-N. When you type in commands that require an argument and you don't give it an argument, you'll often get some basic explanation of how to use it. In this particular case, we tried man and it asks what manual page we want to use. For instance, we can even man, as it tells us. And man will give us the manual for man, which is our manual function. So for instance, if we want to find the manual page for PWD, we can get that. And when we do that, we are entered into a editing environment that is similar to Vim, which we will get to at some point. It will probably have its own dedicated video. But for now, the only thing that you need to remember is that J takes you down, K takes you up, and at any point you can leave with Q, which is quit. We also might be concerned with cat. Cat. Cat prints any file in the operating system. So, going back previously, we can also do man to say uname. Uname prints general system information. That's what we did at the top. I gave uname a -a, and that's because I wanted all the information available to me. I could find that very easily from this man page. So, for instance, if I did uname m, that gives me the architecture of the system. In this particular case, I was simply trying to prove that we are running Debian. Because this is kind of in a containerized environment, that doesn't show up with uname the way that we would like. But that's okay, because we can use cat. Typically in distributions, especially Debian, there is a location. Going back to our / here, let's take a look at ls. Let's take a look at some of these folders. Bin is fairly straightforward. Bin holds your binary data. This means your executables. So for instance, cd, cat, pwd, all these commands we've been using, it's very likely they're in bin. And in fact, I can show you that right now. There's a command called which, and we'll man which. Locate a command. It simply tells you where in the file system the actual command is located. So we can say which cat. And you can see right here that I was right. Cat is being stored under bin. If we ever wanted to use it, we could just say / bin cat. And then we could say bin cat. Make it print itself even. And you'll see here that we get some gobbledygook because it's binary data. But maybe we want to cat something that's just a text file. Maybe we want to cat something that's just a text file. Let me ls my current home directory for you. I have two things. One is a link to my Windows home. Don't worry about that right now. This is a convenience for me. The other thing is a single folder I made called Workspace. Let's go there now. Now let's ls. You can see I have some writing I'm working on. Some dot files, which we'll get to those as well, but the dot files are essentially files that start with a dot. They have a special purpose in Linux, and usually we keep them in our home directory. I'm also working on some card games. But for now, let's simply make a place for us to talk a little bit more about the Linux terminal. Let's make a directory. So, you can probably imagine what this command does. It makes a directory. In this case, we will make a directory called tutorial. Now, if I press ls again, I now get a new folder. And these folders act exactly as the folders that you're familiar with in Mac OS and Windows. It's just that we navigate to them in this terminal situation. Both Mac OS and Windows have their own terminals which are able to navigate in the same way. It's just that they also have very rich GUIs that people have become quite comfortable with that allow them to do much of the same thing. So let's go to tutorial. There's nothing currently in here. So, one thing that we can do is echo. Echo is a simple command based on the ancient Greek deity Echo. Echo was a deity that was cursed to only ever be able to repeat back the thing that was said to them. And as such, Echo can only do the same thing as a command. So echo this simply prints this. Or it can print that. It's a very simple command with one very simple goal. Now, let's talk a little bit about redirection. What is redirection? Redirection is the ability to take one command and take it to another command, or to redirect it to a file altogether. This is a very powerful tool, and it's what makes Unix and Linux so popular. We'll get into pipelining and chaining and things of that nature, but for now, just keep in mind that you can make different commands do different things. And you can have those commands each talk to each other in a line. For instance, I can say echo hello. And then I can use this character. This character says, delete the contents of a file and put this into it. It's important to note that this character means that. This character would mean to simply append it to the end. In most cases, this is what you want because you don't want to delete files, and it's very easy to use this to delete a file. So we will use our two brackets, and we will say test file. And there we go. Now, if I do ls, there is now a test file. If I cat our test file, we'll see that the echo was piped into the test file. This is what makes Linux very powerful, is that many, many, many commands can be piped together like this. For instance, we can say echo hello into our test file and then cat our test file. You can see right here, we appended. So now there's two hellos in the file. But you can also see we did all of that as one command. How did we do that? Well, we did it with this pipe operator. So we echoed hello, and we appended it to our test file. And then we cat out the contents of that test file. This is redirection and piping. This character is known as the pipe. And this particular output we're looking at is known as the standard output. We'll go more into different types of outputs later, but for now, this should be sufficient for most things that you might do on the Linux terminal. Okay, so we can clear all of this with a command called clear. It's also possible to do clear with Control L, which is how I've been doing it. You can also exit the Linux terminal at any point by typing exit, or Control Q. So let's go back. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that we can do with the Linux terminal. We've talked about ls, cat, pwd, we've talked about redirection, and we've talked about piping. These are many of the core mechanics that will allow you to navigate. And with these, you can accomplish most things, and eventually bumble into the things that you don't. But the Linux operating system is very powerful. And there's many different things that we can do with it or want to do with it besides just writing files and playing with files. So why don't we look at how to actually install a utility? So let's look at apt. Apt is the package manager for Debian. So what is a package manager? Well, in Linux, a package is simply an application. The application itself has a binary. Usually it has some small file that goes into another folder called etc that handles configuration, much like the Windows registry. It can have different things, but in general, a package is a collection of files and binaries that allow something to function. A package is anything you might commonly think of. Discord, the chat application, is a package. So was cat, so was ls in a sense. Those are all different packages that are installed on the system currently. Unlike other operating systems that have a rich graphical interface, such as Windows or Mac, Linux tends to have packages that are maintained by the community. And so instead of having to go to a browser, you can simply install them from your command line by using these utilities. So let us start by installing Fortune Mod. This is a very simple utility, and it does something that's fairly silly, and so shouldn't be anything that we can hurt our computer with, and it shouldn't be something very stressful to install on almost any system. So let's begin by doing that. First, we do apt search Fortune. You can see right here, there's a lot of these packages. And I'm not really sure which one is the package I wanted. So originally I told you that the package is called Fortune Mod. Now, I didn't tell you whether it has a dash or a slash or an underscore or any of these things. But you know what the two names are. You know it's Fortune and you know it's Mod. So we're going to look at another very powerful utility in the Linux operating system, and that is grep. Now it's kind of interesting to talk about where grep comes from. But grep comes from some of the earliest days of Unix, and it's one of the most powerful utilities that you will learn. It stands for globally replace regular expressions and then print them. That's what it stands for originally, and it was used on an editor called ED back as far as the 70s. But today, it's simply one command. And of course, we can use man to figure out more about it. And there's variations on it that we can get into later, such as egrep that allows you to do regular expressions, but for now, a simple grep should suffice. So what does grep do? Well, grep finds things. Grep finds things for us that we're trying to find. So let's go back here. Another very important thing that we can learn while we're here is that if you simply press up on your keyboard, you'll get to your previous command. Or you can also do Control P or Control N to go back and forth. We will go back to our apt search Fortune, but this time we're going to use another pipe, and we're going to grep or mod. We're going to get a warning from apt, but that's fine. The kind of grepping we're doing is very simple. And you'll see right here that we have several different packages, descriptions that showed up that have Fortune mod. grep doesn't understand exactly what it's seeing, and so grep will read you any line, regardless of whether it's the top line or a description line. It simply reads out any line to the end of the line that has this particular name in it. And so we searched for Fortune, and grep found anything that had mod in it. So it appears that there's only one, and it's Fortune mod. Now, I've picked this one specifically because I like it. I liked it so much I've already installed it. But let's just reinstall it, just to show you what the process would look like. You simply would do apt install Fortune mod. Interesting. So we've attempted to install Fortune mod, but we get this strange error. This is the kind of thing that would frustrate a lot of people their first time using Linux, and it's understandable. I wouldn't consider this error to be particularly good. Could not open lock file, permission denied. Unable to acquire DPKG, unable to acquire DPKG front-end lock. Are you root? So what is root? Well, in Linux, the user that has the most power and the user that boots all other things in the system is known as the root user. The root user is the equivalent to an administrator in Mac OS and in Windows. And what it's saying here to us, even though it's not very clear about it, to be fair, is that in order to install a package, we have to be the administrator. This really isn't any different than on Windows. Whenever you have to install a new package, oftentimes you'll get a pop-up, and this pop-up will ask, "Are you sure?" What that pop-up is asking is if you want to allow administrative access to install a program into your system. And Linux is no different. When you originally set up WSL or a virtual machine or anything else, the very first time you set it up, you'll be asked for a root password. It's good to remember what this root password is. If you ever lose it, it may be difficult to get back in, and you may have to rebuild the operating system. Remembering what your original password was, we can use a command called sudo. Now, sudo is also a very important and very powerful command. Sudo exists on virtually every Linux operating system that you're going to encounter, and it allows you to elevate your privileges to be able to do something such as install packages. Only somebody with administrative access can do this. Typically, that is the root administrator, but it can also be a variety of different people on the system who have access through sudo. So, in our particular case, we're going to say sudo apt install Fortune mod. By typing sudo in front of any other command, we can run that command as an administrator. It'll ask us for our password. I'll type my password in. It's not going to tell me what the password is for security reasons. Now, for you, you're going to get a prompt for yes or no to install Fortune mod. You can press yes, and it'll install Fortune mod for you. For me, it's already installed, so it'll tell me here that it's installed and it's on this newest version. So, now that we have it installed, what does it do? Well, we can type man Fortune. And Fortune, which I'm sure many of you have probably speculated, simply gives you a fortune, much like a fortune cookie. One thing to notice when we're looking through man pages is that the system we're in right now is typically either less or more. That sounds very confusing and frustrating, but there are two commands called less and more, and they allow us to quickly read things in what I would call Vim style, where we have J to go down and K to go up. Because of this, there's a couple other features available to us that'll save us some time, one of which is /. By simply pressing /, we can now search the manual for anything we need. In this particular case, I want to look for an example for us. we can see right here that there appears to be Fortune databases that we can use. But I happen to know that you don't need to give Fortune a database. Sometimes manual files aren't as helpful as you would like them to be. This manual file is fine, but you do have to read quite a bit of it to see that you don't have to use a particular command argument with Fortune. But we can get some hint of this by looking at the top. This shows us the way that Fortune works. It says that we can use a command called Fortune, and it has the ability to accept all of these various arguments either one at a time or in combination with each other, as you see here. And the options show exactly what each of these do. We can give a pattern, and we can even give a particular series of files. But I happen to know that we can run Fortune as it is, so we'll just do that here. And we can see right here that we've gotten a relatively interesting Fortune. And it appears to be, yeah, we've got a relatively interesting Fortune. Let's see if we can get another one. Oh, that one's much more concise. This one is a true Fortune, not just a quote. And this one is a quote. So you can see the premise of what Fortune does. It's a very simple and very basic thing. But this is a command we've installed, and we installed it from our package manager without needing to go to any browsers or anything like that. We were able to search for it and install it. This is really easy and fun to do with something like Fortune Mod, but it's important to keep in mind that the power lies in the fact that we can do this with MySQL databases, we can do this with Discord, we can do it with Firefox, we can do it with many things. If you have Linux installed on your local desktop, virtually anything you need, even the OBS I'm recording right now, can be installed right out of the package manager. Because this is lazy Linux, and it's not serious Linux or hardcore Linux, we're going to continue to have fun. Fortune is a fun program to install. Another one that's fun to install is Cowsay. So, in the same way as before, we type sudo apt install Cowsay. And as before, I already have this command. So, let's type in man and do Cowsay. So what does Cowsay do? This one's much more nebulous. Configurable speaking thinking cow, and a bit more. The description is more helpful. It says that it generates an ASCII picture of a cow, saying something provided by the user. Interesting that we can allow the cow to say something. We might use that later. First, let's take a look at what Cowsay looks like when we run it. Cowsay. Interesting. So when we press Cowsay and we press enter, nothing happens. We end up with the bar on the next line. And that's because Cowsay requires a command. Cowsay, unlike Fortune, can't be run without a command given to it. If you don't give a command to it, it goes on the next line and it waits for you to give it a command. And it'll keep doing this, and it'll keep doing this until you try and give it some execution character. So, in order to get out of these kinds of things when you get stuck in them, you can press Control C. Control C is our escape character, and it allows us to exit out of a command. So now that we know this, we've Control C to get back to our terminal. Let's make Cowsay actually do what we wanted it to do. So let's do Cowsay, and we'll give it Lazy Linux. And there we go. We have a tiny ASCII cow that says Lazy Linux to us. Isn't that wonderful? Let's make it say something else. Yes, the tiny cow. It'll say stuff to us. It's a very simple command. And we can pick different cows, of course. That's in the manual. But for now, we'll stick with our default cow. I like him a lot. I like his W utters. So, you might have noticed, we had to give cow say a series of letters. We had to give them some kind of a text to say. That's a requirement of the cow say command. And previously, we looked at fortune. Now, fortune is a command that without any arguments, which is the name of the things that we have after the command, without any arguments, fortune will provide us a fortune. So it should be possible then to say cow say and then pipe it into fortune. But if we do this, we only get the quote, and then we get a hanging cursor again. What's going on? Well, in this particular case, it's important to remember that the order of the pipe matters a lot. The ordering determines the execution. We're executing fortune, but cow say is still waiting. So we've reversed our order. In this particular case, what we need to do is have cow say at the end, and cow say will absorb the output of fortune. It's important to remember the order of pipes matter because you need to make sure that whatever the command is that you want to finally execute is on the left because it executes from right to left. Depending on what each of these commands do, you don't want to be piping the wrong thing into the wrong thing. It can end up with some very messy results. So instead, let's do fortune cow say. And this time, it works as we expected. Now we have our cow, and our cow gives us a generic quote every single time, and a different quote at that. So I think that's a pretty good first session. We've covered CD, we've covered PWD, we've covered LS, we've covered cat, we've covered pipes, we've covered redirection. We've even covered uname and even a bit of grep. These are the core and primary things that you're going to be using. And with them, you can navigate most of the Linux operating system you need. Now, if you're at work or even just somewhere out on the go, and somebody asks you if you can figure something out about a Linux or a Unix system, you can tell them maybe a little. But before we go, let's do one last thing. We also went over echo. And one thing we can do is echo our shell. Now, your shell is the current system that you're running on top of your Linux that allows you to talk to it. Bash is the most common shell used in Linux. And Bash is mostly what we've been talking about here. Bash is the program that takes your commands, such as ls and cat, and translates them into things the system can use. There's a couple different shells that you could use. A popular one is ZSH, or Z shell, which is the default on Mac. But on most Linuxes, it's either going to be Z shell or it's going to be Bash. And more often than not, it'll be Bash. Bash is a stable and very functional shell, and it does everything you will need it to do. Bash is more than just a shell. Bash is its own entire programming language, and we'll get to that at some point. But for instance, you can do for I in 50 to do echo I. Done. Bash is capable of doing most of the things that common programming languages you understand can do, and they can be done in the terminal as you're doing other work. Obviously, we could have done this on a file, or we could have done it on any number of inputs or outputs from any of our pipes or other programs. But for now, one thing that I want us to keep in mind is let's go back to the last topic that I brought up but didn't quite get into, which is dot files. So we are in our home directory. We can see right here that the tilde is equivalent to /home cosmic. So let's hit our ls again. We only have these two folders. This is actually a little bit of a lie. You see, ls is not showing us all of the files here. So if I do man, I have to go here, and I can see that if I give it a, do not ignore entries starting with dot. Very strange. Do not list implied. Yeah. It's like, very strange. So do not ignore entries. So by default, it's ignoring entries with a dot. And that seems strange the first time you see it, but that is the convention on Linux. It's not something built in or anything like that. It's just a thing that has been the standard de facto way that you hold some configuration files for local users for probably as much as 20 years at this point. So let's do ls, and then we'll give it dash a. And we'll see here that when we gave it dash a, now there's a lot more files in this directory than we thought there were. There's many, many, many different dot files. Now these dot files are hidden because these dot files typically just control various different configurations in your system. Much like a Windows registry, most of the time you're not concerned with what these dot files are doing. But in this particular case, there is one exception to that, which is our bash rc. Now, I don't necessarily want to get into it right now, and it doesn't really matter for us to get into it right now. But if you see rc at the end of a file in a Linux or a Unix operating system, what that means and what that tells you is that this file is going to run on the initialization of something. It's the first file that'll run, and it allows you to set up any first time things you want to run. Now, in the case of bash, this is the file that will run every single time we open a new terminal. So for instance, if I go up here and press Debian again, I get a brand new tab that has a brand new terminal. And this new terminal just ran whatever is in this file. Now, if you don't believe me, let's go through an exercise together. Now, the next part, this is a little tricky. I'm going to use something called Vim. And Vim is a text editor in the terminal that does not have an interface. And we edit it much the way that we edited more and less. Now, there's also an editor called Nano that can be used as well. There's various other editors I'm aware of. There's also Emacs. One of these editors is going to become very important to you. And it's a very personal decision to decide to do which. For me and myself personally, I use just normal Vim, and we're going to edit bash rc. And now you can see that we're in the file. And in the file, I have many of the things you would expect to find out of a normal development environment. I have syntax highlighting, I have comments, I have line numbers, and I even have percentages and things like that in the bottom bar. Vim is an extremely powerful tool, and many people pick Vim over normal traditional IDEs. And in later videos, we'll go into some of the features and benefits of using Vim in this environment. But for now, just know that some basic propensity with Vim is very useful for being able to edit these files on a system. The reason the Vim is useful is that oftentimes Linux runs on a server, some computer that exists in Amazon or Google, very far away. Oftentimes, working for your employer, you'll be required to do these kinds of things. And sometimes the only thing you have available to you is Vim. And so it's good to know just the basics of how to be able to edit files in it so that you can edit files remotely. Now, we don't need to care about any of these things. The documentation will talk to you about some of what they do, and if you have an interest in editing them, you can. For instance, the PS1, which is a really complicated thing, this controls how our shell actually shows the name. So as you remember, we have cosmic at moose. For right now, though, we're not concerned about any of this. All we're concerned about is to add a tiny, tiny, tiny program to the bottom of this file that will run every single time we get a new shell prompt. And of course, what we're going to type here is fortune, cow say. Yep. And then I type colon W, and that saves. Now I'll type Q, colon Q, and then we'll quit. And now our bash RC has fortune mod. So let's go over and try to start a new WSL session. If you're on any other system, you should just be able to exit your terminal and open again, or type exit. And there we go. Now we have a new terminal, but now every time our terminal opens, we get to see our cow and we get to see our fortune. And it was a pretty good fortune at that for our last one. So that covers our first session. Thanks for watching, and we'll go over more in the next one.